Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank everyone for being here. It was really an amazing summer school this year. I think it spans over 3 weeks, and we had to start early. So we hardly gave you a chance to catch up from Christmas and New Year, and now you have to sit in lectures. So I wasn't expecting so many people, but I'm really excited. Although I'm a surgeon, I originally, you can probably hear from my accent, I hail from Holland. And when I was a medical student there, I did an elective in Bophuthatswana, one of the former homelands. And I was there for 6 months, and I became very passionate about Africa. There's a Dutch saying, they say Africa goes in your blood. I think because we all arose, or we came from Africa, so it gives you a strong, can you still hear me? Yeah. It gives a strong, lose connection. Just please let me know if you can't hear me. So I came, after I qualified, they made me promise to come back, and I did come back and start working in that hospital for almost 10 years. So it was a missionary hospital in the rural Africa. Then after that, I thought I must do surgery, because I found myself doing surgery there. And of course, Grutsker was very famous because of Chris Barnard. So I thought that was a good place to train. So I went there for training, and then I quickly realized that surgery in Africa is very different from surgery in Europe. Surgery in Europe is usually planned, so your patient comes to you in outpatients, you make a planning, operate him 2 weeks later at 9 o'clock, and your life is organized. In Africa, 90% of what a surgeon does is emergency and acute trauma. So you always have to work in the evenings and in the weekends. So I worked there for 10 years in the trauma unit, and then about 20 years ago I was asked to move to the Red Cross Children's Hospital. So since that time I've been working there. So I'm very passionate about prevention because once an injury has occurred in a young child, you can't change it anymore. You can try to make it better, but the biggest win you can get is preventing the injury. And there's an organization, Child Safe, Diana Ross is here, and she is one of the board members, and it's an organization which has grown tremendously. And I think if you ever seen me in the media, on radio or on TV, it was usually because of that. Anyway, to deal with children who are abused and raped and run over by cars and burned is quite stressful. So I had to develop strategies to get my mind keep my mind healthy. So the last 5 years, I've been doing a lot of reading on consciousness because it is a topic which really interests me. And actually, the manuscript for a book, it's not published yet, but I thought I'm playing it out in these lectures, and I'll probably get some good questions and comments, and I can integrate them in the book. So once again, thank you very much for coming here, and let's get started. So I'm depending on lots of slides, so I hope we don't get a crash, no blackout from Telkom, because that will be a disaster. Suddenly it started again this weekend. So it is a course aimed at the reconciliation of mind and body. We tend to think that mind and body are separate entities. And I think what I'm trying to do here in the course is trying to change your mind and realize that there is only one thing. Now, there's two astrophysicists, Fred Hoyle, he's famous for his term, he designed the term Big Bang, and Chandra Wickramasinghe. And they published in 1981 an article. They say that the chance of a working enzyme developing is the same as a hurricane blowing through a junkyard and spontaneously having the luck to put together a Boeing 747. So I think that is a very small chance. And I think with consciousness, it's even smaller, the chance that how consciousness arose, but it did. So it's really fascinating. So I just want to make a couple of disclaimers. So the evolution of consciousness is obviously an extremely complicated process. The story can only be told by taking gigantic steps through the history of our evolution. So this, of course, will skip very important steps, and I would like to hear that from you if you think so. And it may also trample on a number of issues, because you can't take a big step without making an imprint. So the course is very eclectic, so very choosy, and some people would even say kaleidoscopic. I'm going to tell you a lot of different stories, and you have to do a lot of work yourself, because you have to place that in your own mind and form your own opinion about it. So it's really designed to stimulate thinking rather than supplying answers. If anything should be clear from my reading, is that the development of our mind, it should be understood as a process. It's not an on and off switch. It's like you have it or you don't have it. It's a gradual process. So I've been reading the last month the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. You probably know who he was. He was emperor, I think 100 AD. And he was quite a scientist. He actually didn't write in Latin, he wrote in Greek language. And just for himself, to remind himself, he wrote certain things down. It was never meant to be published. But I think 50 or 100 years later, someone found them, and they thought it was very worthwhile. So they put all these loose sayings together, and it's now called the Meditations. And if you go to exclusive books, you can buy it for 200 rand. It's a format of like a pocket Bible with a ribbon in. And he really states he's a Stoic, but he really made some profound statements. So one of them is, everything we hear is an opinion and not a fact. It's a very important one. Everything what we see is a perspective, and it's not the truth. So the course is 5 different lectures. This is more or less the approach I'm going to take. Today will be a couple of definitions, and also like, consciousness is part of life, so what actually is life? So I start with then the next lectures in primitive consciousness, higher consciousness, then human consciousness, so it's sort of like quite a high level. And then in the last lecture I'll discuss a number of consequences of consciousness. So first, introduction. Our mind, I think, is my humble personal opinion, it's the most interesting phenomenon of life. So when I was a little boy, I was raised in a very strict Protestant church with very long sermons. And I remember sitting there as a 6 or 7-year-old boy and thinking, if God created the earth, who created God? So actually many philosophers, very experienced old philosophers, they start asking the same questions as what they were asking when they were 4 or 5 years old. So we've actually learned to not ask the essential questions again. But I often thought about it. And of course, for my work, children, especially young children, the head is a very big part of the body. So if they are injured, usually the head is also injured. And from the 10,000 children we treat in the hospital, about 3,000 have got an injury to the head. And of course, if it's a severe head injury, then they are comatose. They go into a state in which you cannot wake them. And I always wondered that how it is happening that if there's a severe injury, they are deeply comatose, then when they recover, they sort of like, they wake up and they rise up from that. And eventually they start to respond a little bit and then more, and then eventually they become normal. And there are children who have been comatose for 3 months from a severe head injury, and they recover completely. Afterwards they are normal children. So during when I was writing my manuscript and doing the course, fortunately or unfortunately, this arbitrary America's the world's most famous philosopher, Daniel Dennett, he published his book, The Evolution of the Mind, It's the subtitle. The title is From Bacteria to Bach and Back Again. It's a big fat book, and I thought, oh, yeah, when I saw that on the internet that he published this, I thought, oh, all my work was for nothing. But then I ordered a book from the States and I read it, and it's actually a very good account, but it's written for philosophers. I think more for almost like professional philosophers, not so much for laymen. So the course I give is much more simple, and I think it's much more general. I'm also not a real philosopher, I'm just a medical doctor. So it gives a perspective, it's meant to give a perspective discourse of the evolution of our mind. So we have progressed beyond imagination, if you think about it, if you look in Darwinistic terms, from the protozoan to the brightest philosopher. Of course, it is the philosopher who says that. That's quite interesting. We are very chauvinistic about our brains, and we assume that they are the ultimate goal of evolution. I think most of us were brought up in that way. This, however, makes absolutely no sense from an evolutionary perspective. Nothing in natural selection is even close to striving for intelligence. We are complex beings, but complex beings are not necessarily smarter in survival than more primitive ones. The process of evolution is merely driven by differences in survival and reproduction rates. In many ways, Homo sapiens are just a fluke of evolution. We inhabited our planet just for a few 100,000 years. Compared it to the crocodile. Crocodiles have been around for at least 70 million years. Sharks, almost in the same form as they are now. They've been around for 300 million years. So we really are newcomers on the block. So I think many of our troubles started with this gentleman, René Descartes. He wrote in the Discourse on Method in 1637, so that's about 400 years ago now. He was the first one, this famous saying, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And he said there's a mind and there's a body. The mind is spiritual and the body is physical. Now, this gentleman, David Chalmers, he's an Australian philosopher, a young guy, he coined the term the heart problem in 1995, so that's about 20 years ago. And basically the heart problem is what is the border or the interface between the mind and the body. It is undeniable that some organisms are subject of experience. The question of how that works is really perplexing. How can our audiovisual senses create the experience, the quality of deep blue color, the sensation of a middle C? I was listening to Bach yesterday, and it's just fascinating. It moves you. You hear these tones, and it feels like your soul is resonating. How can we explain to entertain a mental image or to experience an emotion? How can we how can experiences in the outside world create a rich inner life? So of course people can be troubled by the hard question, but the real problem is the hard answer. So I just want to go back. Yesterday I also watched an interview of Daniel Dennett with, what's his name? Craig Wood, I think. And they used the same example. If you're thirsty, you think like, it feels like your brain says you're thirsty. So what you do then is then you go and look for a bottle, you send a signal to your arm, and then you pick it up, and you open the top and you drink it. But if it was a pure mental thing, if it was a spiritual thing, somewhere there must have been pressing a button to the body in order to send a signal to the nerves to pick up the bottle and drink. So there should be an interface somewhere, if there's a spirit, a mind world, and a body world. Now, for a long time, for hundreds of years, they thought it was the pineal gland. So that's in the middle of the brain. It's a little thing, which, if you think like where you have to locate, we talk about that in later lectures. But if you have to make an idea, a physical space where you are thinking, it's actually exactly where the pineal gland is. It's like behind your eyes somewhere, about 1/3 in your brain. That's sort of like when you look around. That's sort of like where your spirit is. But unfortunately, the so-called theater, that was often thought that there was a little man sitting in a control center, like with a screen, deciding what's happening or what should happen. But of course, if there is a little man, then that man will also have a little man inside. So you can see that in the graph. I don't know, it's very small, but so it's infinitum. So when I talk, I usually talk about pediatric trauma and child abuse and lecture to medical students. And I often start with saying that we are animals. So the medical students, they get very annoyed. And I usually explain that I don't mean it derogatory. It's not a derogatory thing to be an animal. It's just we are not stones. We are not rivers. You know?
I think there's some hearing thing that, I'm not hearing you very well. So try and further back.
Okay. I don't know, there's the technician. Less bass. My voice is very low, so maybe you reduce the... Is it better like this? I don't want to irritate you with my low voice. Can you hear me better? Slightly better? Okay, so the students get annoyed if I mention maybe a little bit softer. They get annoyed when I say we are animals, but what I mean is we are not a river, we are not a cloud, we are not a tree, we are really animals, if you look at us. But we are unique animals, if you think about it, very unique. And you could say what I said earlier, we are a glorious accident of evolution. We attribute rights to animals, to other animals. There's no other animal who does that. We are concerned, I mean not all of us, but most of us are concerned about the environment. No animal is that. We created wine, especially here in the Western Cape. We designed script, philosophy, erotica, gastronomy. It's an unbelievable range. And we also created religion, morals, and duties. But my favorite philosopher is Michel de Montaigne. The word essay, he invented that word. He was the first philosopher who started writing about topics rather than about the Bible or about people. And we really should be very careful to dress ourselves in the hubris or megalomania. He says, we cannot create even a worm, but we create gods by the dozens. So, our place in nature, what actually are we? I would like to say a few things about materialism versus paternalism. Materialism is everything, it states that everything is ultimately physical, not really material, because Einstein, he said E is mc square, which means matter can be changed to other things, to energy. So physicalism is actually a better term, but in the philosophy and in the literature they talk about materialism, that everything is just matter. And it's often associated with reductionism, which means that all phenomena explained are at a reduced level. Arthur Schopenhauer, also one of my favorite philosophers, we can only know material objects through the mediation of the brain and its particular organization. All what we know has passed through the mind and through the machinery and fabrication of the brain. So I would like to stress what many people do not know is that materialism has got the word mater in it. So mater is mother. So materialism refers to the phenomenon of a simple form giving birth to a more complex offspring. So that's basically Darwinism in a nutshell. So you start with something small and then it becomes more and more complicated. Now this is opposed to paternalism, and Daniel Dennett calls it idealism, so purpose-driven, which is a place of superiority and a top-down direction of power. So typically in most of our monotheistic religious systems, it gives this idea that an omnipotent being created the weird and wonderful world in the very same way as a potter created a pot. So if you look at the world and the tremendous complexities of it and intricacies, that means that if the world was created by a being, that being must have been enormously intelligent and complicated and able to do everything. And that's what they think. So what is life? So you know that Schrödinger, he wrote about this, and he was a physicist, but he said that you can have a cat can be alive and dead at the same time. So that's quite a challenge to our brains. Now, there's no proper definition of life, but most definitions which you can find in textbooks and study books is it's something like a self-organizing system. Some people even say that the whole world can be seen as one organism. That's the so-called Gaia theory. So in more abstract thinking, life is a human construct. A human construct in the same way as a house is, or a chair, or a city, or a culture, art, a dollar, or religions. They're all man-made, they're depending on our brain. So just to define a human construct in the philosophy of science, it's an ideal object where the existence of the thing depends on the subject's mind. So a stone will be there in nature, if we think it or not. The stone will be there. But for instance, charity, or what we call life, may not be there if we don't define it. So life is a human construct. It's created by us. In nature, it doesn't exist. Now you know that the 17th century thinkers, they had this idea that you had inorganic matter and you had organisms. So they thought there was a sacred elixir which you add to inorganic substances and then you create life. So they thought there was something, a spirit, a magic vital substance in life. So that was then regarded as the difference. Sadly, over time, vitalism has proved completely wrong. Inorganic can nowadays very easily be converted in organic and vice versa, in the laboratory and outside laboratory. So I don't think you ever thought of hearing about tardigrades in this lecture, but I'm going to tell you. Tardigrade means slow, tardis, great stepper. They're also known as water bears or moss piglets. They are water-dwelling, segmented micro-animals with 8 legs. They're smaller than 1 millimeter, and they are able, what is fascinating about them, they are able to survive extreme conditions. See, they have been around for 500 million years. Just remember, human beings only probably 200,000 years, so a fraction of that. And it's assumed by many people that they came from outer space because they are so tolerant to all kind of damage. They can resist a temperature of minus 272, so that's 1 degree above absolute zero, all the way to 150 degrees. So this is one of them. You see they've got beautiful 8 legs, and they've got these 4 claws on there, and it's like a snout. Beautiful little animal. So they were actually first discovered by Anton van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch scientist who invented the microscope. He took some dust from roof gutters and he added water and he saw little animals. That's how he describes them. Now in 1948, Tina Franceschi in Italy, she founded samples of dust of over 120 years old. You could add a drop of water and these animals could be reanimated. So how are they able to survive without water? So they seem to avoid any dehydration, destruction, and they enter a very funny shape. They call it a tun. They curl up in a ton. So you see the animal at the back there, and here, when there's no water, he sort of like shrinks. So the metabolism, it slows down to 0.01%. It slows down 10,000 times the normal rate. And to compare that, for instance, a polar bear who goes into his hibernation, he slows his metabolism down by 4 times to about 25%. But these tardigrades, 10,000 times. And they probably isonucleating proteins, trehalose sugar helps them with that. They are definitely more resistant, more admirable, and remarkable than we are. There's no doubt about it. Are we the only inhabited? Most of you think, I assume, that we are the only planet which is inhabited. Wrong. Not anymore. Last year, 11 months ago, there was the Israeli NGO and they sent a rocket, a spacecraft, and crashed into the moon. But besides an archive of human civilization, it also carried a few thousand tardigrades. So there is absolutely no doubt that they are on the moon now. Yeah. And actually, interesting enough, Chris Mason, a New York geneticist and professor of physiology, he is actually actively busy trying to identify and isolate DNA of these tardigrades to put it into humans to give us eternal life, believe it or not. So talking about the life and death, another example is the jellyfish. Yeah, the jellyfish is basically cycling. It's recently discovered that they also, like us, they've got a 24-hour cycle, diurnal, and they require sleep. But it is immortal. It can freely cycle between adult form and its juvenile stage. So they, all the time, it's like a wave. So it actually doesn't die. Viruses and bacteria, are they alive? A virus carries all the information for its multiplication, but it cannot do it itself. It's just basically a little bar. It has to be swallowed up by a cell, and then as soon as the cell has done that, then this becomes active and it changes, it deprograms the cell, and then the cell only starts producing viruses. But it can't do it by itself. It has to infect another organism to do it. So a self-organizing system able to reproduce, but are highly organized and growing crystals which are developing. Are they alive? Most of us, we don't think so. Dormant tardigrades sitting on the moon there. Are they alive? Is a single leaf falling from a tree, is it still alive? Does it die on the way when it hits the ground? If you pluck a leaf and put it in water, or flowers, are they still alive? This is a picture in Newlands where I often walk my dogs. This is a leaf which I found there. But a leaf, when you take it from the tree or a flower, when does it die? Does it die? Most mammals cannot reproduce by themselves. Are they therefore not alive? Even we are, like a man or a woman, can't reproduce by themselves. So maybe we are also not alive. Is an infertile mule alive? This is a foal of a mule. It looks very much alive to me. But according to the definition of life, it's not. Artificial intelligence, is it alive? All the core parts of the Darwinian process are there. They replicate, mutate, they compete with one another. The very process of natural selection is happening there. If that is central to the definition of life, then these things count. Is artificial intelligence alive? In my personal opinion, I think it's absurd to say that. Not many of us would assume that our cars, our televisions, our computers or watches are alive. Indeed, I mean, a watch, it can indicate the time probably far more precisely than we are able to, but it doesn't comprehend time. It's just a smart mechanical device manufactured by people assisting us in indicating what is the exact time. So what makes something alive? To me, intentionality and biological imperative. So intentionality, I mean the will to live and to procreate. And we all have that very clearly. We all want to eat and procreate. A biological imperative seems to be essential for life. So what does it consist of? We want our own territory, we compete with each other, we reproduce, and we've got relationships. So I always say when someone says software is or artificial intelligence is alive, I says, have you ever seen a PC multiplying? I haven't seen it. So the RNA-World hypothesis of life, you probably know about it. It states that RNA was the earliest organism on the planet, and only RNA was necessary, so without the help of DNA. And it's assumed that it's sort of like Darwin describes this geothermal pool in which maybe 4 billion years ago life arose. Actually, just 3 years ago, a group of Wits university described small strands of molecules that can link and to create larger molecules with the ability to replicate themselves. So that, once again, in a nutshell, the RNA-World hypothesis is that in the earliest time, there was just only RNA. And they make the comment that the small molecules are very promiscuous and can join other pieces to themselves. In the Middle Ages, just another thing to discuss. In the Middle Ages, they had great difficulty in defining what water was. We all now know, we know now what is the formula. But at that time it was wet, transparent, tasteless, could be frozen, dissolved in many substances. They were unable to characterize it because they didn't know what it was. But of course we know it's 1 oxygen, 2 hydrogen molecules But it's got very many different formats. It can be salty, muddy, dyed, liquid, frozen. It can be in a cloud, and it's all water. So defining life is tantamount to trying to create a theory about mammals by only observing zebras. Some theologians define science as merely name-giving to things which are already existing, making it a more or less semantic exercise. And of course, I mean, most of us will know the first 2 chapters of the Bible in which people were told to give names to things. So the whole of science is nothing else as that. Galaxies popping out of a stellar womb. If you take a big telescope, you can see this stellar womb and its galaxies popping out. Are they alive? I think most of us will agree that, or what we take as norm is ourselves. So if something looks like us, then we think it's alive. Feelings for life and non-life are actually inborn. They come with our brain. Babies also seem to have an innate feeling for continuous trajectories. I saw a nice video on YouTube in which they're feeding dogs with a bowl, you know, the metal bowls, and they put the food in, or meat. So the dog goes there, and then the bowl has got little wheels, and it's remote controlled. So by the time the dog goes there and he wants to take a bite, the bowl moves. So the dog gets a hell of a fright, because he also knows that, you know, what is an object. He doesn't get a fright if there's an animal moving, but if an inanimate object moves, he gets a fright because he's not expecting that. So in 1944, in the Second World War, 2 psychologists, Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel, they made this video. I hope it works. I want to show it to you. Just watch this video. So if you watch this video, it's just only a couple of figures, triangles, one big triangle, a small triangle, and a round circle and some bars. They're moving position. But that's not what we see. We make a whole story out of that. We can see there's this big triangle, he's chasing the small one, the little round ball, he hides in the corner, he's scared to death, you know. So, but of course that is all aired on. It's just a couple of things moving. There is not such a story. We make it up. Now, Charles Darwin, he basically was the first one to write about evolution. I think he should be regarded as one of the, or if not the biggest scientist. If you read his books and the detail he pays attention to, it's unbelievable. So he's got interesting quotes. He says, "My mind seems to have become a kind of machine which is grinding general laws out of a large collection of facts. And the second one, I find it the most interesting. At some future period, not very distant, as measured by centuries, the civilized races, just read this, the civilized races of men will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races. So that's happening, but it's quite an amazing statement. So the civilized races are the ones who are killing the civilized, are killing the savages and replacing them. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Huh? And the very essence of instinct is that it is followed independently by reason. So just about the definition of consciousness, I just want to make reference to the work that you can use one word in many different ways. And I use the example of the definition of love. The Bible is full of love. But there's the Greek Testament, and they use 4 different words. The first word is philion, companionable of, like Philadelphia. The second one is agapein, which is precious love. And this is you know, the agapanthus, which means a lovely flower. And it's beautiful stages, and you can see them through the whole of Cape Town at this time of the year. Then there's charity. Many people quote that Jesus says God is love, but what they don't, that word in the Greek language is charity. So it's not erotic or anything else. It's basically looking after the widows and the orphans. That's what's meant when they say God is love. That's the word. God is charity, not the others. And of course, erotics, we know about it. So in consciousness, and when people talk about consciousness, there's also 4 different levels. Being awake, as opposed to being asleep. Being responsive to the environment. Being aware of yourself. Like sometimes you, especially if other people look at you, then think, oh, you know, what are they looking at? And you think about yourself in a completely different way than when you're just walking through the forest and relaxing. And then, of course, being aware of other minds, which is, philosophers call it the theory of mind, so that you're aware that someone else is also thinking. So this is a graph that I make just for my own clarity. I think this is the way I look at it. So there's a conscious level where we are all sitting here, but there's also a very big part of stuff going on in our brain subconsciously. And in a child who, one of the children was run over, he's deeply comatose, so he's unconscious, so he's not aware of anything. Now, Daniel Dennett, he talks about competence without comprehension. And I want to talk about simple versus more intellectual consciousness, because consciousness has got different levels. So this is an experiment I did a few years ago in Tokyo. It's really amazing. On the left side, you see on the right side, you see the map of Tokyo with the railway system, and on the left, you see the slime molds. So what they did, they built the cities of Tokyo with the surrounding suburbs with sugar on oat flakes. And then they let the slime molds loose, and they see what was happening. And I'll show you the video. Just watch this. So first they go in all kind of directions. They go to the suburbs in all kind of ways. But then you see then they start to prefer certain tracks, and they become more clear. And it's unbelievable, amazing. But they mimic, they exactly copy the existing railway suburb system. So we think we are very intelligent, but these slime molds, which are tiny little things, they can do the same. Now, Daniel Dennett, in his book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back Again, he uses this example. So you know this cathedral, Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona, which is, I think, being built for since 1886, so it's 140 years now. But funny enough, termites with probably less brains or smaller brains than they can create a similar structure. So they do it from bottom up. Of course, it's completely different. We build it from a plan and we go down, but they go by themselves. So I just want to say to finish off this lecture, what is the reach of our consciousness? Alison Gopnik, she's a development psychologist. She states, if you read her books and articles, babies, toddlers, are smarter than adults. And she calls them, children are butterflies, so they can fly, they can do much more things. Turning, the older you get, you become more and more reduced, and you become a caterpillar. Now, we tend to think about consciousness and awareness of something which happens inside your brain. You're aware of your own emotions or feelings. But consciousness is also awareness of your environment, what is around you. And that is probably the most important thing. So, Pablo Picas, he said, every child is an artist. The problem is to remain an artist when you grow up. In education, this beautiful on TED Talks, I don't know if you know that website, you can see talks on education. Education is the same. We think we educate, but actually we're killing off directions which children want to go to. So in the early days, when you're small, your reach of consciousness is like all around. The babies, they're aware, they're looking at everything around them. A toddler, if you put a toddler or a 5-year-old somewhere, they will know if there is someone watching them. They are very quickly in picking that up. We don't have that. So they basically, their awareness is light going in 360 degrees. So in later life, unfortunately, like us, it becomes a beam. We focus our attention, but if you focus your attention on one thing, of course, that gets highlighted, but the price you pay is that you black out all the other stuff around it. That's a severe price you pay. And I don't know if you've tried to play memory, game memory to the same cards with children under the age of 8. You lose. It's impossible to win because we can only remember the card by focusing on one card, and if you focus on that card, you blacken out the rest. So children don't have that ability yet, so they just remember everything because they are unable to focus, so therefore they got a much better memory. So that's the end of my lecture, and tomorrow we'll be talking about what actually does the brain do. And I thank you for your attention. I'll be very glad to take comments or questions. I've given you a lot of information. I hope it's not too much overwhelming, but I think over the week it will become more simple. Yes?
Absolutely.
Can you hear me? Absolutely. The question is if Neanderthals were conscious. I'm absolutely convinced. I even think bonobos. You know, a bonobo is a dwarf chimp. With this, we are. I'll mention it in one of my later lectures, but of course we are primates. So the apes, there's 5 of them: Homo sapiens, chimps, gorilla, gibbon, and orangutan. So from the chimps, there's a gracile chimp, which has only been described 30 years ago, and they're called bonobo, B-O-N-O-B-O. So there's a guy in Holland who's done a lot of research by observing these bonobos in captivity. And there's stories about in the zoo that the bonobo, he sees a pigeon flying into a window, so he doesn't see the window, and the pigeon like falls down because we've all seen that in our houses. So the bonobo goes there and perks him up and touches him and nurtures him, and then eventually when the pigeon wakes up, he climbs into the tree and he throws him in the air. So this is just very high level of, I don't think most of us, many people won't do that. So this is one example. So, and I think they are far lower than Neanderthals. So Neanderthals, they also had burials and all that things. So I'm absolutely convinced that they were conscious. Okay, then I'll hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.